Welcome to the Vision for Life podcast, an ongoing conversation between the pastors of Fellowship Denver and the church at large. Each week, we talk about life, faith, the Bible, and how to follow Jesus as we go about our daily lives. I'm Autumn, host of the podcast, and Hunter and Dave are joining me today. Welcome.
Autumn, it's great to be here. And what our listeners don't know is that you are so running on fumes today that you had to redo your standard intro 3 times before it took.
What our guests also don't know is how much to actually believe anything you say in this space of the podcast. Because
well,
you
trust
always
me,
just...
Autumn has not brought her A game today.
Wow. You know what? I'm often not on this podcast with the two of you, even though I work with both of you almost every day. You guys have special energy here today.
Yeah.
There's special energy.
Well, it turns out Hunter flew in just to record this podcast episode. So
I'm just trying to spur Autumn on to love and good deeds, and she needed a little spurring this morning.
It sounds like it. Hunter is committed to the building up of the 3 of us in this room, plus Jesse. Jesse actually got roped into all the shenanigans in the previous episode. So we're just in a couple of ways picking up where we left off. That was a really great attempt at a segue to some serious conversation. So anyone listening can choose to believe what Hunter said in this first portion of the podcast or not. We will leave that up to your own discretion today. But we are picking up a conversation that we began in our previous episode about a book written by Yuval Levin that is called A Time to Build. Dave suggested that we read this, and we thought it would make an excellent topic for a podcast discussion. And so today, we're examining the last portion of this book. Hunter, could you recap our first conversation and bring our audience, our listeners, and us up to speed on where we're jumping in today?
This book is about politics in the macro sense, not just in the what happens in Congress or who's running for president sense, but in the sense of how do we structure our society, how do we live together as people in the United States, in our cities, how do we do life together, build things together. And his observation is that institutions are the forms that order our common life. Institutions are typically organizations or that involve more than one person that have a specific purpose, and they usually have specific values and outcomes and goals and aspirations. And the 2 insights that are critical are that institutions are durable over time, meaning they're often meant to even last more than one generation, but to be handed off and handed down from generation to generation, so they're durable over time. And at their best, they shape us and they mold us into certain kinds of people so that we can do something together by being shaped and molded by the institutions that we couldn't simply do on our own. So his thesis is our political world is healthy when our institutions are healthy, and our institutions in the modern world are suffering decline. And they're not just suffering decline for the reasons that we typically think of, which is corruption within the institutions. That's certainly a problem. But underlying even that is a deeper problem, he says, that we've turned our institutions into platforms for leaders or for people to do their thing rather than as durable organizations that shape and mold people over time. And so the title, A Time to Build, is a time to rebuild our institutional life and to rebuild it by being recommitted to what institutions have typically done, which is to have a common cause and a shaping and molding effect, rather than what we're asking them to do now, which is to be platforms for individuals to display their talents. So when we look at our world through this lens that he's given us, we can usually see lots and lots of examples from sports teams, which have become platforms for star players rather than common associations to win games, to newspapers, which have become platforms for superstar journalists rather than having a common mission, to churches, which can quickly get turned into platforms for pastors to display their gifting rather than the life of the body of Christ together. We can see all kinds of examples of this in our world, and he does a great job of diagnosing it. We talked about that last episode. And today we're kind of moving into the positive side of this, which is, so how do we rebuild?
Yep. The book is structured in 3 parts. In the first, Levin offers his diagnosis of the crisis of institutions. In the second, he examines how that is played out in a number of institutions, some of which we mentioned in our first episode, and that you just provided examples of, Hunter. And in this third section, he suggests a way forward. He uses the words recommitment and renewal a lot. So, Dave, could you help us understand Levin's suggestion of how we actually go about recommitting to and renewing our institutions?
He's basically challenging us to do something counterintuitive, which is, okay, the institutions are struggling. The natural thing for us to do is to be kind of rats on the ship and let's get off the ship. And he's like, no, if everyone does that, society fails. What we actually have to do is to stay on the ship. And for the most part, there's plenty of footnotes to that.
Yeah, we'll offer up some of those.
But he's basically saying we need to actually begin to act and to inhabit and to reinforce our commitment to the institutions themselves. He begins to use language like devotion, love, and a kind of long-standing, a long-suffering kind of quality to these institutions. And that the only way that sort of society is going to be stabilized is if the institutions themselves are stabilized. And the only way that happens if individuals within those institutions lock in, stay committed, when everyone else, it seems like, are running off the ship.
He offers some reasons that he sees as very real reasons that we might have some mistrust in the institutions of our day, both historically and currently. We've mentioned some of those: corruption within an institution, the lack of leadership or inability of the leadership to live in accordance with the values of the institution, which is a form of this corruption, an idea of freedom that simply mistrusts institutions inherently because of the way we're conditioned. And then the fact that institutions can be ways in which the people within them or affected by them are actually oppressed or taken advantage of. Those are very real reasons that we might have a mistrust of institutions. And yet, Levin says our recommitment to institutions, by which they will be renewed, is still very worthwhile. They're a foundational aspect of our society that we can't simply tear down and replace with nothing and still get along without. As you just said, Dave, our society will entirely disrupt without institutions of some sort. And so I'm going to read a quote from page 167 of the book, in which he identifies 4 of what he calls the most significant benefits that institutions provide. He says this: a comprehensive accounting of what our institutions do for us would be practically endless, but the most significant benefits institutions provide might be broken down into just a few categories. Number 1, they constrain and structure our activities. 2, they embody our ideals in practice. 3, they offer us an edifying path to belonging, social status, and recognition. And 4, and they help to legitimate authority. By examining each of these, we can unspool the case for investing ourselves in a revival of our institutions, and we can also see why that kind of revival could be achievable.
Many of us recognize that there is a low-level unhappiness, a sense of despair, lack of meaning or purpose that is pretty ubiquitous right now. There's something called the World Happiness Report, which has all these metrics of happiness, and we're sort of at an all-time low right now and have been for the past few years. And this is ironic because on other metrics, as we mentioned in the previous episode, other metrics actually should indicate that we should actually be fairly happy and grateful as a
Like
society.
lifespan, standard of living.
Lifespan, economics, like we actually
General
have,
level of income.
yeah, we live in a remarkably prosperous era. And yet, at least within the past 50 years, we've never been more unhappy. And I think what Levin is getting at here is that because we've abandoned institutions and the kind of validation and the kind of meaning and purpose that those institutions can provide, when we don't have that anymore and all of that meaning and purpose has to be self-generated, it simply doesn't work. And so I love that he highlights that as a function of institution. Rites of passage, development, accomplishment that fits within certain virtues and values in those institutions, and then recognizing when you've achieved that. That's stuff that's really, really important for human flourishing. God's made us to function in that way. And the point is, it can't be done apart from that more structured institutional format. We've tried it and it doesn't work.
One note I might insert here for our listeners too. This is one of the classic insights of what we might call the conservative impulse in our society. So in our world, in our Western world, there's two big impulses. There's a conservative impulse and there's a liberal impulse. And I don't quite mean that in the Republican and Democrat sense. I mean that in the classical sense. The classical liberalism, its impulse is to free the individual from unnecessary constraints or oppressive structures in order for the individual to be free to pursue life, liberty, meaning of happiness, and to become the best version of themselves. That's kind of the liberal impulse. The conservative impulse is that we need to maintain traditions, what Levin is calling institutions. We need to maintain the good that's been handed down to us for generations, and we need to maintain that and hand it down to future generations because it provides a stability and an order to our society which contains all the anxiousness of people striving to become the best version of themselves and constrains even some of the worst impulses of freedom or liberalism and helps us hold together as a society. And American history is actually the fusion of this conservative and these liberal impulses. We have a high commitment to freedom. That's what our country was founded on, but it was not a unconstrained kind of freedom. Rather, there's traditions that have been handed down. Even the way our government was set up was not just invented out of nowhere. It had been learned from some of the best lessons learned, especially in British society, and was these institutions in America were created after a pattern that had been proven. And so we wanted to have freedom, but we wanted it to be expressed within these institutions of government that we created, where freedom could be handed down from one generation to the next, and our cultural project could be handed down from one generation to the next. So as Christians, we actually need to learn from both of these impulses and even learn to get a little bit outside of the polarization that happens in our political discourse today and see there's real insights here. And this is an insight from the classic conservative impulse. Levin represents that. He is a conservative in the classical sense of that term. We've discussed books by like Jill Lepore is a historian. She's a liberal in the classical sense of liberalism and talks about how we build a nation committed to the classical ideals of liberty. So if our listeners wanted to check out the other impulse, we would recommend this author, Jill Lepore. But we need to recognize wherever we sit on kind of the political spectrum as individuals, we need to recognize that there's wisdom in both of these impulses that we need to learn from.
Mm-hmm. One book I'll mention specifically by Jill Lepore that's really accessible and short, in which she actually lays out an argument not entirely dissimilar from what Levin is, is suggesting here in a recommitment to institutions. One of the liberal impulses that you're mentioning, Hunter, in the last few years that we see on display in reaction to some of the corruption in institutions is to simply tear down or deconstruct. And Jill Lepore, as someone who is more politically liberal, but is classically liberal in the sense of wanting to preserve our Republican democratic ideals, represents a case also for recommitting to and renewing institutions rather than tearing them down. And one book that you had recommended to me that I would recommend to our listeners is short, easy to read. It's called This America, The Case for the Nation, in which she sets up some suggestions that are similar to what Levin is unpacking here. As we've considered these central insights that he's offering, these points that resonate with us in this book, the necessity of institutions for the structure of our society, the way that institutions can help individuals flourish, the way that we've seen institutions even affect us, institutions that have shaped who we are and have become and are becoming right now. And discussing all of that, both in our previous episode and then in this episode, we also wanted to share our own ideas based on Levin's insights through this book about what we do about this, what our response is in light of the insights and suggestions that he's sharing. So, Hunter, let's run with that question. Where do we go from here? What do we do about this moment in which our institutions are particularly weak, and yet we're also recognizing the necessity for them?
Well, this is the part of the conversation when we move from just summarizing what Levin has said to us discussing it and adding our own thoughts a little bit more. And as we were talking about what do we do, I think the obvious thing is we need to see how much we need to participate in institutions. And we need to participate in institutions as owners or co-owners. We have a inheritance or a share in the life of the institution, and not just as outsiders who are poking at it. Now, owners doesn't mean that we all get to be leaders. So we referenced earlier formative institutions for us that first formed us not because we were leading, but because we were participants in them. I referenced seminary. I referenced my fraternity in college. I referenced the first accounting firm that I worked for and how it shaped me and molded me. But one of the first practical things that we would say you got to do is to acknowledge I need to participate in good, healthy institutions. And so I need to assess whether or not I'm able to participate in specific institutions that I'm called to or that I need to participate in, and find ones that I can participate in.
Do we want to just list some? I mean, I think that's...
Yeah.
The first thing that comes to mind, and we've talked about this before, but what does it look like to kind of lean back into family institution, to the institution of marriage, to school, and even local universities? Like, I feel like all of these are the kinds of institutions that help to stabilize us. And, of course, the institution of the church. And, you know, we're finishing up right now a DNA class, which is sort of the pathway to membership. And even language of membership, I think, is so interesting in light of this, because it's offering people an opportunity to literally sign a document that they are now a member of they share together, they're partnering with the institution of the church. It's such a literal way to participate and reorient themselves back into making the institution better by their presence within it.
And I notice for how many people that is weighty and it's significant. There's even deep emotion for some of them attached to the question of, am I going to choose to commit myself to this particular body of Christ? And part of that is because of what Levin is talking about here, where our institutions have become so malformed and misshapen that some of us have been hurt or misshapen through institutions. And so to now do the hard and courageous work of going, but I still need the body of Christ cannot participate in this one is significant work for some people. And I'm just so proud of them for doing that.
Yeah, it's super encouraging. And it's also interesting that so many people who are functionally part of the institution of Fellowship Denver Church still can't bring themselves to sign membership. Not a ton, but a handful of people, and so that barrier is still there, I think, for all the reasons that we've discovered in this book.
The reticence to commit to something that is institutional.
They lose their outsider status. They are now participating in the baggage they think is the institutional church. Like that, those are the things in their mind they often can't just get over that prevent them from being a member.
There's a significant way for many people that this happens through their work, particularly when they see it as a vocational calling. Think of some of the professions that we've discussed and mentioned, that of being a lawyer or a doctor or nurse, someone within the healthcare industry. And there's a dual level at which they're committing not only to an institution that they probably work for or work at which their work takes place, but also to the profession, which is a larger understanding of the institution. So when a doctor goes through medical school and takes their boards and swears the Hippocratic Oath, decides to go about their profession in a way that brings life and flourishing to people and does no harm. They're committing to the institution, this medical institution, an understanding of how to exist within this greater framework that allows them to carry out their work and vocation in a way that supports the institution of the medical profession, that of being a doctor, and can either lead people to trust that institution through the way that they conduct themselves, or to breed a sort of greater mistrust of that institution.
I experienced the same thing in my previous line of work, accounting. You are committing to the institution of certified public accountancy, and that institution is really governed state to state, but there's a profession you're committing to that has certain standards, and you're agreeing to follow the standards of that profession regardless of which firm you practice your accounting within, which institution you practice within. The accounting firm I worked for collapsed, and it collapsed because a couple of our partners who had probably begun to think of the accounting firm as their platform for earning a living and kind of becoming superstar accountants. I know that sounds like a huge oxymoron, but just go with it for a minute. Superstar, rock star accountants. They started to treat the firm as a platform for which they could do that and make lots of money. They also violated the professional standards of the institution of accountancy. And that scandal, it was called the Enron scandal, it was so significant that it brought down the whole institution of our firm in order to preserve the institution of accountancy, which lived on. So it's fascinating to me to think about how institutional realities have shaped my life, and for better or for worse.
That's so fascinating. We've had examples here, Hunter, in Denver, where some churches, in order to preserve the institution of capital C Church, realize that it's better for them to dissolve because they have admitted and have gone astray from the charter of the church, that they've decided we're just not going to exist anymore. We're going to close it down, but for the sake of the greater institution. That's fascinating.
So the first point, though, is to find institutions that you can, in good conscience, partner with, submit to, participate in, be shaped and formed by. And with the exception of the family, and I think that's a notable exception, with the exception of the family, we get to choose what institutions we participate in. In fact, this has been true of American society from our very beginning. When Alexis de Tocqueville came and wrote his famous Democracy in America examination of American society, one of the things that he was writing back to his French people about is like, everything they do in America is a voluntary society. It's all these things they willingly choose to form, but are not binding because you're born into it. The family is the notable exception, and I think it's important to note that exception because for most of us, our first place of learning how to submit to and participate in an institution is within the family, even if that family is not ideal. And then I would say I'm not married, so even to those of us who aren't married and we don't have spouse and children, when I say family, I'm not just talking about what is sometimes called the nuclear family, but rather the extended family as well. So one of the great joys of my adult life has been to participate in and to give back to and to help shape and form the life of my extended family, and to recognize that my extended family, now that all the kids are adults, my extended family has certain rhythms of life that we practice together, and it's actually really important for me to participate in those, because in learning how to relate to my parents, continuing to relate to my parents and to my brothers, to my nieces and nephews, I'm really that learning institutional relational life that has implications far outside my family. So I know people who are working hard to maintain relationship with family when it's not easy, and I think that's important work that they're doing.
There's a sub-point here that I want to make. If we do our best to assess what institutions we can attach ourselves to, be an insider of, and take some level of ownership within, not leadership as you mentioned, but ownership of also, Hunter, and our participation in them, then I think we will be encountered with moments when we have to leave an institution if we can no longer commit to it. And this could be for a variety of reasons. It might be because of some sort of corruption or scandal, but also it might be just a shift in the institution itself that necessitates you leaving because you can no longer participate as a fully fledged part of that institution. It might be something that is enforced upon you, but there's still this aspect, if we understand the foundational nature of institutions and how they are designed to shape individuals, how they're foundational to our society, of leaving well when you find yourself in that position, if you find yourself in that position.
And if what Levin is saying is true, that our institutions are pretty weak right now, and they've been weakened and misshapen because they have been treated more as platforms, then one of the implications of that is, unless that problem is fixed tomorrow, many of the institutions we participate in are pretty unstable. Not unstable in the sense that they are just going to collapse, although some will, but unstable in the sense that they don't have a fixed identity and they don't have fixed values or fixed commitments that you can always bank on for multiple generations. And because of that, individuals are put pretty frequently in the position of having to ask, can I continue to participate in this? Last week on the podcast, I gave an example of Calvin University in Grand Rapids, Michigan, which has shifted its institutional commitment. It actually says on paper it has the same institutional commitments, but how that's going to be applied to prominent faculty members has changed from what they've done since their inception. And that's the kind of malformation, that's the kind of shiftiness that happens to our institutions. And many of us are going to probably be participating in some institution that started out as one thing and it's been that for years, and it begins to change and shift because new people have the platform and they are taking it in different directions, which puts us in the position of having to decide, can I continue to participate?
One way to assess that might be if you find yourself, as you mentioned earlier, if you find yourself always on the outside, simply critiquing and unable to participate in the life of the institution, then that might be a red flag to assess whether or not you can continue to fully participate in or support that institution.
Autumn, something I hear you saying, though, that I think is great. What I hear you saying is that there's actually a gift that we give to the society at large, is when it comes to where we have to leave an organization, we do it in a way that creates as much peace as possible. And when I hear you say that, I'm immediately reminded of a handful of Proverbs. One, there are actually a list of like things that God hates, and there's a list of 7 things that God just abhors, and the last one is he who sows discord among the brethren, and as like the culminating thing that God so dislikes among his people, among society, is just sort of wanton chaos and sowing discord. Another one says that hate stirs strife, love covers an offense. Hate highlights and causes offense to exasperate and stirs it up. Love settles and covers offense. And so I think that's an important biblical virtue when talking about institutions and groups of people and being a part of systems of people and ways of belonging, that if you do have to leave, and we're saying there are times that might have to happen, do it in a way that actually highlights God's sort of desire for human flourishing more generally.
Mm-hmm. So here in this section, when we're just sharing our thoughts based on the insights from the book, the first point that we want to make of what's the way forward? What are some practical suggestions about our own conduct in this moment, our perspectives, and our presence and our action? And the first is to develop this ability, assess whether or not you're able to partake in the institutions, and then do so in a way that is actually participatory, that takes on a level of ownership. What's another suggestion?
I think if we're just kind of coaching folks and we're thinking ourselves, how do we participate in institutional life? A big one is, if I've decided this is an institution I can and want to participate in, I need to participate in, to recognize that part of institutional life is always having to adopt some customs or practices that would not be your preference, and to go along with decisions that would not be your decision. That is an essential habit to long-term institutional life. So I was referencing our seminary last time we were talking on the podcast, and one of the things they had was a dress code that was more strict than my accounting firm's dress code. You had to dress up in a coat and tie every day to go to class at this seminary. Now, there was a purpose there. It was to create an environment where students, through their dress, came ready to learn. Most seminary students didn't look very good in their coats and ties because they had fished them out of the Salvation Army or the seminary's hand-me-down closet.
That's where I got all of mine.
I looked good because I had to have them for some days at the accounting firm, but the rest of y'all didn't look very good. And yet there was a decision that every student had to make of, this is what the institution requires. I can see it has reasons, even if I don't even love the reasons or would prefer to dress some way differently. I'm going to go along with this, even though I wouldn't normally get up and put on a coat and tie to go to class.
And any institution will have seasons in which you have to submit to some decision or reality that's not favorable to you in the moment. I think of another institution, classic, is foundational institution of marriage. Often there are seasons in marriage where it would be easier, it would alleviate pain and suffering in the short term to exit a marriage. However, for those who decide to submit to the institution of the marriage, not just for their own personal benefit, but for the benefit of the institution and how that institution benefits society, there's all kinds of stats to show that when you decide to stay in it 3, 4, 5 years later, the vast majority of people are glad they did. But it takes a mindset shift to go, I'm committed to staying in the institution, submitting to it, even though short term my own preferences and levels of joy and happiness aren't there. I'm locking in, and I'm going to bet that the institution itself will shape me into a certain kind of person to benefit society in a way that could never happen to me if I exit the marriage or exit the institution.
I think there's an important qualifier here. One of the insights that I read earlier in the quote from the book that Levin shares is that institutions help to legitimate authority. But one of the crises of institutions is illegitimate authority, or authority that fails to act in accord with the central values of the institution. So how do we wrestle with that aspect of this dynamic? I agree that there are moments when we've decided to commit to an institution. We're a part of it. We're an insider. We've taken on a level of ownership. We'll experience this friction and still have to decide to submit. But can you offer any insight as to how that dynamic works and how to think about that?
And often the individual in power has failed to live up to the ideals of the institution because the institution has allowed that. And they've often allowed that because of what Levin is saying, because that individual has a platform that the institution fears holding to account or that the institution wants to enable. So I think he's actually diagnosing part of why that happens, right? And I think this is a good opportunity to use what he's showing us here as a way to assess the health of institutions. Can this institution be committed to something that we might call tradition, or it might be called, in some cases, standards or values that everyone in the institution is accountable to? That would be how I'd assess the health of it and whether it's something I could continue to participate in. I'm very dubious of institutions that suddenly have a major shift in their purpose, for example, or a major shift in one of their foundational beliefs. I'd be very dubious about that. And usually that can be traced to one or two influential leaders. Now, the asterisk I would put on that is I'm not dubious of institutions that change their beliefs when it is a restoration of back to something that was historically part of the institution's charter or was part of the institution's original commitment that they've lost. So I'm not dubious of every time a pastor in a church has a slightly different vision or direction for the church. But really what that vision and direction is just a return to original Christianity or something the church was committed to in its earliest days that they've kind of lost. I'm not dubious when a seminary president or a grad school president wants to change the overall culture of the school, but really what their change is not some new idea they're introducing, but it's a restoration back to the institution's original purpose or its original charter, its original convictions. But I am dubious when a leader wants to introduce new ideas, new theology, new conviction, new direction that's just not what the institution has historically been about. That's a huge red flag for me. And that's an institution that I'm not sure I want to continue participating in if that's going to be the trajectory that it takes.
Mm-hmm. Perhaps another litmus test, Dave, is you alluded to this before, but is that there's an observable commitment to the good of and health of the people within the institution. This is, we can easily see this on display in marriage. So you might find friction within that, but if the two parties are still committed to the good of the other and the health of the marriage and the institution, even when there's a difference of opinion about the way a certain scenario or season of life should go, if both are still committed to the health of the other, the good of each other, then I think that's a litmus test also as to whether or not to submit to the authority in that scenario, the authority of the other or of the legitimate authority. You can see that on display in families and also in other institutions. You may disagree with a leader with a given approach or a decision, and yet if there's an observable commitment still to A, the central ideals of the institution, as you just described, Hunter, and B, the good and health of the people who are attached to the organization. That could also perhaps be a factor.
Absolutely. I was kind of struck by the contrast between platform leadership now that's so popular and what we just got to see on last Sunday, which is introducing elder candidates who, for the past 2+ years, have been going through this pretty significant process of preparation, of assessing and becoming the types of people who could meaningfully lead and direct our church. And it's the opposite of platform, in that these guys have been, if platform is up top, these guys have been down low. They've been quietly, silently grinding, working on character and on sort of the kinds of qualities we would all want in anyone who we're going to trust and follow. And yet that process is such a humble process and the opposite of celebrity, the opposite of platformed. There's no drama involved with that. There's nothing viral around what these guys have done for the past 2.5 years. There's nothing viral about it, except they've become a kind of person that you would be willing to follow and trust, even if you disagree with the decisions. So back to your point about love and about care for whether a spouse in a marriage or people in a church or organization, if there isn't that character there that you can actually trust, then it's going to be difficult to give them the benefit of the doubt whenever decisions are made that maybe are contradictory to what you would think should happen in any given situation.
That brings us to our third specific suggestion, and you just led us right into that, Dave, and that is, for all of us who inhabit an institution, who participate in it, we ourselves need to be trustworthy participants and conduct ourselves with integrity. If we have committed to an institution and are fully participating in the life of the institution, are working hard to assess and submit to it, then we can only fulfill our role within it to the extent that we also conduct ourselves in a trustworthy manner. And this isn't an aspect of perfection by any means. It's not to say that we can't also have shortcomings and grace for each other, but that if we've committed to the central values of that institution, that we do also live in accordance with them.
Yeah, it's this idea of integrity. I mean, it's are you living in such a way that matches with the values and virtues of the institution you're a part of? And if the answer is no, then you're a destabilizing force to the institution. And so then there's need to repent and to acknowledge it and to say, I'm not living in step with this value. We see this at the earliest stages of the church, where people like Peter, who are foundational in the early church, have at times stretches where they live contradictory to the core of the gospel and the core ethic of the church, and they have to be confronted, and there's repentance and there's restoration, and it's always messy. But I think if each of us are going to take sort of our own responsibility for strengthening institutions, the first thing we can do is ask ourselves honestly, am I actually reflecting? Am I actually a kind of person who embodies the best of this institution? And if I'm not, then be open for change and reformation. as part of your commitment to the institution.
There's one final point that we'd like to offer in this assessment. This is something that Levin mentions. We also wanted to mention it as we round out our discussion today. Hunter, would you share this last suggestion that we pulled from the book and wanted to mention?
Yeah, we said complaint and criticism can't be our default position or our primary habit if we want to make our society a better place. And this is so hard. It's easy to get pulled into primarily critiquing our institutions, whether that be the particular institution we're part of, like a local church, or whether that be the broader, bigger institution like the church. It's so easy to get pulled into just complaining and criticizing and pointing out what is wrong. A book like this might even push you in that direction because it's about 2/3 diagnosis, which is penetrating and insightful, and it's about 1/3 how do we actually build institutions, and it's a little more speculative and tentative in the building. You can even feel him being less sure in his suggestions. So we live in a time when everything orients us toward criticism more than it does toward being constructive. And so we're going to probably have to do work to keep ourselves in a constructive place. And I think this conversation has put enough caveats around that I don't have to caveat it anymore, except to say we need to be constructive in how we engage the institutions we're part of.
Well, Dave, thanks for introducing us to this book. Dave and Hunter, thanks for having this discussion with me.
Hey, one last thing our listeners might be curious to know. Dave brought this book to our attention as we were thinking about some of the direction of our church, and we are making plans to be a more formative institution as a church that has a way at its center to shape and mold people that we've never done before. And Dave's been giving lots of thought to that. So this book is having direct, creative outcome in the life of our church that I'm excited down the road to share with folks.
Yeah, that's a nice little preview of what's to come.
Yes, thanks for mentioning that, Hunter. And thank you all for listening and joining us in this discussion today. This book has been helpful and challenging and insightful, and we'd suggest you read it. The book, again, is A Time to Build by Yuval Levin. If you have questions or suggestions about today's episode or something you'd like to hear us discuss on the podcast in the future, you can send all of that anytime to podcast@fellowshipdenver.org. Thanks for joining us on the Vision for Life podcast. Special thanks to Adam Englund for our theme music, to Jesse Cowan, our producer, and to Judd Connell, who provides transcription for these episodes.